Hi, welcome to today's webinar. We're just going to give a few moments to let everyone enter the virtual conference room. We are filling up dramatically. I hope you're all having a fantastic day so far. So today's webinar, hopefully you're expecting this, it's what 5 years of audit data tells us about your supply chain. We're going to kick off shortly. You're on mute at the moment. Please do ask questions as we go along. But while we are waiting for everything to fill up, we're going to do a bit of a poll. And the poll is on the screen now. So this is Slido. If you've not used Slido before, you can type in slido.com and hit audit data, that hashtag audit data, or you can scan the QR code to take part in this poll. So let's see who is able to, and it's looking at that. No one yet, so I'll give you a little bit of time, just as a bit of a starting point to see where we are so far. Okay, so just getting started, yeah, excellent. Not uncommon. I'm just filling up now. We will kick off in earnest probably at about 2 or 3 minutes past. So just as a reminder, to answer the question, you can scan the QR code, go to slido.com and hit hashtag audit data, or if you've had the app and done this before, you can do that as well. Okay, so a bit of a mix so far. If you weren't expecting a Slido, there's another one later on. So if you haven't got a chance or don't get a chance to fill this one out, don't worry, you will have another opportunity for a bit of audience participation later on. Okay, yeah, people are getting there now. Interesting. Okay. Once again, thank you all for joining us. We're just going to start in just a moment, waiting for the lobby to fill up, which it is doing rapidly at the moment. We will be covering what 5 years of audit data tells us about your supply chain. And at the moment, just to kick it off, a bit of a question, straw poll of our attendees today of where you are on your sustainability journey. Okay, look at that. So I think we'll still got results coming through, and we will share in the follow-up to the webinar details of this poll, as well as the recording itself, slides and answers to any questions that have been raised. So moving on to our webinar and content and speakers. So I'm Will Addy, I'm Head of Sales at EMEA, for EMEA at SEDEX. We're joined today by Claire Fitton, who is our Social Sustainability Specialist. Over 15 years working in business and human rights, she has worked with companies, trade unions, NGOs and government bodies on the practical implementation and effectiveness of human rights due diligence practices. Also joined by Abigail, whose role is to support buyers to map, monitor and address risks in their supply chain. Abigail specialises in FMCG and retail industries, having monitored supply chains of up to 4,000 sites for leading brands including Colgate, Palmolive and Cooperative Retail. So that's our speakers. What are we going to cover today? And I'll have the next slide, please. There we go. So the session today is going to cover key learnings from 5 years of auditing data, how to turn data into actionable insights, some best practice to help your supply chain become more sustainable, and where to start to help prevent and manage risk. And also, finally, and you probably expected it, it's how SEDEX is supporting businesses such as yours, with a bit of time at the end for Q&A. So, without any further ado, I shall hand over to our first panelist. Claire, over to you.
Thanks so much, Will. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to start off by just giving us a bit of a whiz through how we at SEDEX use data in order to provide insights that can lead to action and impact on improving working conditions in your supply chains, and how you can do the same as well. Next slide, please. So from the very start of your sustainability journeys, and we saw from that poll that you're all at different levels, but data itself can be a grounding service to you wherever you are on that journey. And using the data that you already have is what we could all do better in order to make better decisions. So from the very start of your journey with new suppliers, you want to be looking at the data that already exists. I have picked out a few choice examples here. You might be moving into a new supply chain. Take Morocco. We see that there has been an over 200% increase in the number of audits in Morocco over the last 5 years. It's a real burgeoning market at the moment. It's somewhere that we're seeing real growth. So if you're moving into a new supply chain, you might not have a wealth of data that you think is at your fingertips, but there really is. There is already an awful lot of risk data out there that can tell you down to the very granular level of what type of activities are done on site, just how much that impacts what risks are there. We have tools internally that we use for this, and we see which of the manufacturing processes are more risk, there is more potential for risk, and where there are potentially some of the sites or the sectors where there is slightly less risk. We can also look at the data that has been coming in as we've seen this growth in audits. I've picked out here some choice data on just the most critical risks that we have seen coming out of Morocco. You'll see there is a bit of a spike in health and safety. That is kind of common across most countries, as it is definitely where we find the most evidence, the most data in general. But you'll see some of these smaller areas, freedom of association, that's a high number proportionately of risks in this area. That's something that you would want to be aware of from the start of your trading relationships with your new suppliers. Similarly with the wages data, this is something that you can get on board with from the start, and you can be proactive in your discussions with suppliers from the start. Next slide, please. Continuing on this journey with new supply chains, Mexico is another country where we have seen enormous increase over the last 5 years. We've really seen the numbers and the sector growth in this area. Mexico is somewhere that in the last 5 years, until very, very recently, it was the #1 country in the SEDEX audit data for the highest number of non-compliances or non-conformances on site per audit. So it was somewhere where we were always finding, and are still always finding, an awful lot of non-compliances. Where you have that level of risk, you want to go in forearmed with that knowledge. We've seen that in 32% of the audits, which is a very high proportion, there are incomplete health and safety assessments, and in a further 18% there may be no assessment at all. That can tell you that when you're going into those supplier conversations, you really want to be starting to ask about the health and safety assessments. You want your buying department to know that health and safety assessments is a very frequent issue in Mexico. They have inadequate contracts or missing crucial elements from their contracts with their workers in 18% of audits. Again, that's a very high percentage of audits to have this issue, much higher than we see on average across global supply chains. So having that knowledge again means that you can really preempt risk from developing into damage for your companies. Next slide, please. So you might not be heading off into new supply chains. You might be in supply chains or sites where you have been embedded for a long time. And we can look at that data as well, and it can really help us inform decision making in a different way. This might not be about those new conversations or how you're starting off, but about how you actually really mitigate risk once you've found it, once you're in the weeds. The majority of SEDEX members have sites in China. It's a very high percentage. We're over 60% of sites are in China. We have seen that these numbers are only increasing with the size of our membership. This is not something that is going down. And in those sites in China, we have an awful lot of findings. As you can see, pushing 80% now of those audits have a finding against overtime, with a non-compliance in the overtime section of the audit. This is an incredibly common issue. If you have a site in China, you are going to be faced with a question around overtime. It is inevitable. Just moving on to that next slide, please. So just having knowledge that this issue is persistent helps you to understand the kind of activities that can really help to mitigate it. This is not something where you can just talk to a supplier and ask them to close this off and deal with it themselves. This is a really systemic issue. This is something that you will need to look for further solutions to. If you know that you're going to be likely to be facing this, you can still use the data to help you. You can look for other sites who have historically been able to close this issue, and you can go to them to understand the activities that they did that were successful. You can look at your supply chain and you can bandy together sites who have the same non-compliances. This goes across the board. If you see lots of sites in a similar region with similar non-compliances, this is an opportunity to deal with it in a larger group scenario where you're more likely to have more success because there are more companies engaged in this process. There is also an opportunity here where you have these systemic issues to look for other buyers from the same site as you, which SEDEX can help in that connection process of really finding where you have leverage and how you can make more long-term sustainable change. And also working with local partners to really tackle that root cause, and then watch your data come in over the next few years and see whether you're seeing the reduction in those non-compliances year to year to really measure the change that you're getting. So we're really looking at ways that you can use the data to be more creative in finding solutions rather than just storing it, keeping it, refresh the next year, actually using it to decide where you need to do what, how you need to do what. It's providing solutions as well as insight. Next slide, please. And the last area I really want to talk about with this data is that once you have gathered your supply chain data, you know where your risky countries are, you know where the persistent non-compliances are coming in, you know where the high risk areas are that you have seen in these new supplier sites, or what challenges you are likely to be finding. You also need to know whether or not the activities you're doing are appropriate to the workforce as well. Within SEDEX, we gather an awful lot of workforce profile data, and this is something that we're really increasing at the moment, improving our ability to do. But as long as you are collecting this data, it is because it can inform those activities. If you gather data on the gender breakdown of the workers who are at a supervisory or a managerial level, the workers who have permanent contracts versus those who are in temporary employment, and workers who have other vulnerabilities that intersect with their gender, such as migrant status, you have a much better idea of the risks that are being faced by individual worker groups that might be different to others, and whether the training that is being offered to improve risk areas, whether the activities that are being proffered are actually going to be able to benefit all. Are they in the languages that are needed? Do they have the gender sensitive considerations that are needed? If we take a small example of this, the apparel and textile or garment and footwear industry has long been presumed to be a heavily female dominated workforce. Over the last 5 years and beyond that, we've seen a real decrease in the number of women in this workforce. We see it now at the moment, it's at about 55% women to 45% men. If you just work from that statistic alone, you might be thinking, oh, there's activities I can do to try and either encourage women back into the workforce. Are my workers capable of returning to work after either marriage or maternity leave? Are these areas that might be restrictive to them? Is there discrimination in my work sites because of this? And you might start to undertake activities to resolve those areas. However, if you go further into the details and the data of your supply chain, you might see that this data is actually very different dependent on not just the sector you're in, not just the country you're in, right down to the region that you're in. The data on women and the change in the workforce is really heavily influenced by change in Bangladesh and also in China, two of the largest sourcing countries for the apparel and garment and footwear sector. If you were to do the same activities in Pakistan, where the workforce is dominated by men, or conversely in Vietnam, where it is over 70% female workforce, you would be undertaking activities that would not be appropriate to the scenario. They would not be solving problems specific to the risk So really diving into that data can give you a much better idea of not just what challenges are out there, but what is the most appropriate action to take. Next slide, please. So just to kind of round this off, if we're kind of looking at this as a bit of a process, once you have collected your raw data about your supply chain, which is something that SEDEX is bread and butter for as one of our activities, we're really the house which can house all of this data, from the non-compliances year to year, from where the risks are, from what the trends are that you're seeing in your own supply chain. You can map all of that raw data that's coming in, that workforce profile data. You can start to map that and extract the trends, the insights that are most appropriate to you. You know the direction of travel for your business. You know where you might be heading next. You know where you're embedded, where you're seeing where you've got really stable relationships with suppliers, where you want to make more long-term change because you're committed to those supplier sites. So you know what insights you need to start extracting from that data. And then once you have those insights, you really need to start to convert them into activities. You actually need to use that data to inform what you do. You need to make it so that you're making it gender appropriate, so that you're not going to do more harm to some of your workforce than you would otherwise. You need to make it sectorally appropriate to you and to your workforce. And you can look for those opportunities to collaborate and to work together with both your supplier sites and other buyers. And then that in itself, all of this together, is what leads to impact. If you've been able to actually use your data to inform the activities that you do, then you can also use that data to track the change. You can see what happens as a result. You can look back and see whether or not you are reducing risk. You can see whether or not you are having intended consequences, like a growth in the number of women in supervisory positions. You can track that KPI. You can track whether or not you're seeing more of your workers who have got permanent contracts, things that make and put their positions more stable and reduces risk in your supply chain. And from there, your journey is not complete. Your supply chain is not yet perfect. It will never be perfect. You can start all over again with that new data that's come in and repeat the process, and on for that continuous improvement that we always want to see. So that is just a little insight into how we use the data here at SEDEX and how we think that we can help you better to improve your supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. That was really interesting stuff. In particular, very insightful how you can use that kind of trend data to take action. And I know from the SEDEX perspective of that principle of continuous improvement, and what we find necessarily when we start to look at our global supply chains, it's not about a red mark or report card. It's about a starting point of where to go and where to take it. In particular, some of that trend data, which if you've taken a kind of surface level and not looked into the depths of it, how it might tell a different story and suggest a different action, and the importance to kind of peel back the onion there and look a bit deeper into the data really, really stands out. So thank you so much, Claire. Really, really appreciate that. So now I'm going to hand over to Abigail, who is going to talk about how SEDEX can support you and your business. Abigail, over to you.
Thanks, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. So, my name's Abigail, and I work for SEDEX as an ethical trade coordinator. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my role here and how I work with businesses to support them to make the most of the data that we collect and gather here at SEDEX. And then I'll be telling you a case study about how I supported one of my customers to make real impactful change by taking more of a top-down approach to their risk management. So just next slide. So the Ethical Trade Coordinator service at SEDEX works to support businesses to implement the SEDEX tools and products that we have to offer. So this can be quite difficult, especially for new members, just knowing where to get started with creating a monitoring program and kind of setting those KPIs, looking at those areas that you really want to address first. But we also work with sort of long-standing members and well-established brands who have very rigorous monitoring programs in place. And we just support them with more sort of that improvement side of things. So looking at new projects, looking at ways to kind of improve the way that we address risk, and different sort of ad hoc tasks like that, or projects like that. So at the moment, we support more than 15 members with various projects. As a team, we manage over 20,000 supplier sites globally, which is quite large. And so we have a huge impact and for over 62 million workers overall, which is really important, because when we're doing this work, I think a really important thing to remember is that everything we do is to try and make the lives of workers a little bit better. So yeah, really positive. In terms of our role, it varies. Everybody does a different project with a different client, and we really kind of provide that more bespoke service to make sure that we meet the needs of that specific client. But our core responsibilities are around that supplier engagement side of things, so reaching out to suppliers, helping them to join the SEDEX platform, complete the self-assessment questionnaire, and get the right links in place to provide visibility to our customers. We also support with audit management, so that involves the booking of audits and also sort of supporting the completion of corrective actions, getting that evidence uploaded and verified by auditors. We also support with reporting and analysis. So I mentioned a little bit around KPIs, but we support with creating or producing modern slavery statements, other annual reporting. And we also are just here to provide general support and advice. We like to say that we're almost like double agents, and the really good thing about ethical trade coordinators is that we kind of have that inside ear into everything going on at SEDEX, which can be really helpful, especially as we're kind of moving, developing and creating all these brilliant new products and features. So really great. You can see we've got a diverse sort of range of clients. They move across different industries, and we work with really well-known brands, so Co-op, M&S Food, P&G, and M&M, many others. So really, really great trusted service. So move on. So I'm going to tell you, before we get into this, well, I'll be telling you today about a project that I've just started with a new client. And that project's really around helping them to take a top-down approach towards risk in their supply chain. So they've actually been with SEDEX for some time now, and they've had sort of, I think, more than 5 years worth of audits. But as SEDEX just collects the most recent 5 years of audit data, we report on that area. So before we get started and I tell you about that project, I wanted to get your insight. I can see some of you are already shooting away. So yeah, if you haven't already logged onto Slido, you can use the QR code here, or you can go to slido.com and put in the hashtag audit data. And yeah, just really want to get an understanding of what is the priority risk in your supply chain. So this is going to be really interesting here. I can see already health, safety and hygiene is really high. That's kind of what we can expect, as Claire kind of showed us. It's a really high risk area for a lot of businesses. And also forced labor, that's sort of what we'd expect. And a lot of other as well, so that's interesting. It'll be definitely interesting to hear in the questions at the end if there's any areas that are a real priority for you and your business. But yeah, this is quite what we'd expect to see from, especially from following what Claire's shown us. And yeah, what I'd expect. Brilliant. So same with you, really. We found by taking a look at all of our non-compliances over the past 5 years, we found that as a business, there's a really a lot of non-conformances coming through around that health, safety and hygiene area. So this shows all of the non-conformances that were found over 5 years, sorted out by the 9 categories of the ETI base codes. If you're not familiar, we do have this other part, the last column there, other issue areas. This is because the SMETA audit assessment goes a little bit further than the ETI base code. It has other categories there around management systems and some on environment that just help us to really sort of make sure that we're ticking off every area that we should be looking at. So it's a great thing with SMETA that it goes beyond the ETI base code. But yeah, so as I said, we can see that health, safety and hygiene is a little bit higher. This is quite common because of the stringent controls that tend to be in place around health, safety and hygiene. And the fact that there's usually a lot more controls around it, even at sort of a policy level. So yeah, now we're just going to take a look into those in more detail and see where are those risks in health, safety and hygiene. So here, the big red arrows, obviously the most high risk areas that we want to look at, and then we've got some amber arrows, so I'll be talking you through those. So as a business, we wanted to know what is the most important area that we need to make sure we have addressed consistently as a business across all of our sites. I should mention, so with this project I was running, it was with a sort of European-based food manufacturer, and they wanted to really understand the risks in their own supply, like not their supply chain, their own sites. So this is another really interesting way that SEDEX can help you. And so what we wanted to know is, are our policies that we've introduced, are they being rolled out consistently? Have we got the right information to hand at every site? Are there issues that are coming up at certain sites that we wouldn't really want to see? And have we kind of tackled the different issues that have been raised properly? So with those big red arrows, they're pointing at business critical non-compliances. Now, those are really important to address immediately, and many customers have sort of policies in place around this. But as a business, we really wanted to make sure that that problem was entirely resolved. So yeah, really important place to reflect on there. We also can see that there's these sort of clusters around chemicals and health and safety management. So that's another area that we want to look at, understand what policies we've put in place as a result of those non-conformances, and make sure that we've sort of translated that over all of our sites, so that issue is not going to get raised again in another audit. And then finally, we've got this big sort of bar of major non-conformances in relation to fire safety and fire alarms and evacuation. So again, that's a really important area, especially for the safety of workers. So just really want to make sure that that's addressed. So next, just got a lag on my end. Bear with. Have a look. Maybe I can start talking anyway, gabbing away.
Can't have a presentation without some technical difficulties, Abby. Don't worry. Let's see where we get back on that. So we're seeing improving policies.
Brilliant. Thank you, Will. You're at my rescue there. So yeah, actually, I just wanted to mention some other bits about that sort of health and safety thing. So yeah, we often think about these really kind of emotive issues around when we come into these kind of monitoring systems. We think about things like child labor, forced labor, but actually, you know, health and safety is so important for our workers. You know, happy, safe workers make for more productive workers. And it's just really, really crucial to ensure that anyone coming onto site is looked after. So once we've kind of drilled down and we've seen these kind of areas of risk, we were able to look at our non-conformances in more detail and see what kind of corrective actions have been provided. We can then kind of use SEDEX's offering of resources to just make sure that we're having the most consistent approach. So I just pulled out a couple of resources that I like to use a lot. The one I will bring your attention to the most is the third listed in the row, so that best practice guidance. That is essentially SEDEX's Bible. It has got all of the information you need about how to prepare for an audit and how to follow up with an audit. It's also got in it a list of all of the policies and reporting that every site should have to hand at any one time. So it was really, really instrumental in helping us to understand what sort of information packs we needed to make sure we had together, or what reports we also needed to make sure that we were collecting. And this will kind of help us to make sure that we don't have any issues like that being raised again in the future. We've also got that 2.1 health and safety management system document. That helps with specifically guiding around how to improve management controls on site. So by following that guidance and tweaking the self-assessment questionnaire, you can also kind of really improve the way that your sort of your risk scores on the SEDEX platform, and really improve the way that customers score sites. So really stringent management systems show that you're really able to address risks on site and handle those appropriately. Also got sort of want to remember, if you're thinking of joining, there's a SEDEX e-learning platform, which is just fantastic. It's full of resources written by our training team and short courses that can help you to improve different parts of your business. And so just next slide, please. Hopefully no lag this time. We will see a little bit. There we go. So just wanted to take a final minute just to talk about, you know, the brilliant ways that you can show this improvement over time. So when we're doing this hard work on improving our risk management, fundamentally, we really want to be able to shout about that hard work and how seriously we're taking worker safety. So this is an example of how you can show that long-term impact and that long-term success of carefully formulated policies and carefully implemented management controls. So here is an example of a graph, and you can see at the start there's the amount of lost time injuries is 0.5%. So that's looking at the amount of lost time injuries over a 12-month period. But then after there's that real implementation of stronger controls, or once that audit program started, see there's a steep drop in the amount of injuries that sort of occurred after that audit data started to come through and those improvements were being made. And you can see then there's kind of a little bit of a rise and fall as kind of settled in these new policies and procedures, but then coming down to this really brilliant 0.10% injury rate, which just shows a really brilliant improvement for workers on the ground. So just a little bit of an example of how you might want to report all of this hard work to stakeholders, and yeah, show what all that hard work has done for workers. So I think that's all from me. So I'll throw back to Will, and I think he's got some questions coming in for us.
Thanks, Abigail. That was great. It really shows how data can tell you a story and how it isn't just those main business critical factors, but actually how some of the clusters of non-compliances can tell a story as well. I had no idea just how many suppliers you're engaged with in the ETC team, or how many millions of workers that might have impacted. So fantastic to hear, and how you're having a foot in both camps, so to speak, in SEDEX and with our customer members, can give that kind of advantage in terms of what you can bring to them in their business. And also some great stories there about that kind of projection over time. I know one of the challenges many businesses face is kind of evidencing their ESG story, and part of that is that reporting on those trends over time. So showing that we're able to do that, and you were able to do that with our members, is fantastic. So really useful. And interestingly, you know, our Slido showed exactly what you saw on your first graph there, in terms of health and safety being one of the biggest issues. But enough from me there. We've had quite a few questions coming through as we're talking. So what I'll do, if it's all right with you, Claire and Abigail, I'll ask the question. You can kind of pick up who might answer. So first one, bear with me. First one is, when you refer to audits, do you mean on the ground physical audits, or do you mean gathering data from questionnaires or similar? And can you gather meaningful data? So two questions here, apology. Can you gather meaningful data from questionnaires and trust their responses?
It's a great question. I can start on that, and please, Abigail, feel free to chip in or add anything in afterwards. So the data that both myself and Abby presented today came from on the ground audits. SEDEX does have another tool, the self-assessment questionnaire, the SAQ tool, which is another excellent tool for managing your supply chain and for gathering that data. They do both have different strengths. So when you are assessing the data, when you are looking at the data, it's definitely worth considering some of those areas and how you are using it, and how they can support each other to tell a broader story and to verify each other as well. If you have longer term supplier relationships with trusted suppliers, there is no need to have big full-on on-the-ground audits as regularly as frequently. We want to see that audit fatigue be reduced. We want suppliers to be rewarded for their positive performance. And where you have long-term trusted relationships, the SAQ is an excellent way to keep gathering that data so that you can keep looking, particularly that workforce data, at where the vulnerabilities might be creeping up, where you might want to keep an eye on things for trends, for changes, where you might see this country, the risks are changing, overlaying that with risk data to see, do I need to do additional activities again? Is it time for another audit? Is it more appropriate to keep going with the SAQ? If this is an entirely new supplier where your relationships are still fragile or being built, the SAQ is a great way to get that initial boost of data. And then once you have put them into the audit program, to really verify and to see where they are at on that kind of transparency journey to you, to be able to cross-check between the two tools is a real a boon to your business.
That's
Yeah,
great, Claire.
I mean,
Thanks. Oh, sorry, Abigail, over to you.
Sorry, Will. No, I was just going to jump in and say what Claire said is really important. I actually find that with the self-assessment questionnaire, it's really, really important to kind of stick to that best practice of having it updated every 6 months. We really encourage that. The way that the SAQ and the audits work together is really important as well. So sometimes we may, for example, see an issue come up in an audit around sort of a new and emergent area that we wouldn't have expected to see based on the self-assessment questionnaire. So, for example, recently, as we've had that seasonal worker scheme kick off in the UK, we've seen examples where there are Nepalese workers on sites during the audit, but we hadn't seen that information come through from the SAQ. So this is where they really work together hand in hand. But of course, they're not exhaustive, and SEDEX will always encourage to have other tools in place as well. So looking at worker voice as well to make sure that issues are always captured. But the great thing about the SAQ and the audit is that they kind of work hand in hand, and what one misses, the other picks up, which is really, really important.
Brilliant, thanks, Abigail. Really insightful. Yeah, I've heard it described as just two different lenses to look at the same kind of issues, and it tells a bit of a story and helps you, to Claire's point, create that action and plan, then create that impact. It leads us quite nicely onto another question we've had from the audience. I'm new to SEDEX. How do I know where the biggest risks are to my business? Quite a broad one.
Yeah,
Great question.
Should I take that, Claire?
Feel free, go for it, Abby.
I'll start. Yeah, so SEDEX has got a really important product. It's called Radar, and so this is a fantastic tool. It's got in it a lot of risk-based information that is slowly gathered and generated as you start to kind of engage more in the platform. But what it's also got is a pre-screening tool, which is really valuable. So it helps you to look at the sector and the country risks and get that insight into your sort of supply chain and your business right at the start of your journey. And then there are other reports within it, sort of around management controls and things, which you'll be interacting with more over a long-term period. And connected to that in Radar is also informational tools as well. So similar to some of those reports I showed you earlier, there are reports that will help you to know what to do with that information. So once you know where the risks are, it will guide you towards addressing those.
Brilliant, thanks, Ella. Anything to add, Claire?
I think that's been great. I would just say when you are exactly looking at that risk, it's the overlay of these datas, overlay that radar data, that kind of global perspective down to that country, down to that regional perspective with existing audit data, with other sources. There's the ITUC do a great global risk map every year, which they update, which can really point out some of those most hotspots. Data from there feeds into Radar, but it's really useful to get that broad context and to really kind of keep on narrowing down and narrowing down.
Absolutely, brilliant. Thank you both. A couple more coming through here, and we've still got a little bit of time, so we'll carry on. How can I measure the impact of my supply chain management activities? I think we had a little bit on that, but Abigail, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so yeah, we looked at one example of how you might want to do that. The benefit about SEDEX data is that you've got that annual look. So you've got 5 years worth of an annual look. And that really helps you to kind of capture a point in time and then see how you're improving year on year. So I support a lot of customers to do annual reporting around, say, modern slavery or their gender data, or sort of even just what their sites look like in terms of unions or sort of committees. And by doing the annual reporting, you can really compare. So yeah, I mean, SEDEX has got so much data, but it's really about how you choose to chop it up. So you could do it in whatever sort of, however your porter flows, or your porters flow, or your calendar flows, and just to meet whatever requirements you have as a business, sort of depending on your industry or sector. So yeah, lots of ways.
Thanks,
I could
Abigail.
add yeah, I'll add another just additional point on this, that the direction of travel that we're seeing with impact reporting, especially where it is being driven by both legislators and now investors, is to actually really provide evidence that substantiates the claims that you're making, to have that tangible connection between the activities and the actions that you're doing and the results that you're seeing. So whereas before you might have looked to measure impact on number of non-compliances in your supply chain that you have closed, now there is real movement to looking at that sustained closure, making sure things are not recurring the next year, that you've got to root cause of activities and you're seeing sustained change. And you can also measure that kind of return on investment piece that Abby has spoken a bit to, that reduction of accidents and injuries, that reduction of turnover, of churn of staff, that reduction of overtime hours, things that we know do actually negatively affect a business from an ROI perspective. So there's a lot you can kind of overlay here, but really looking, I think, at connecting your activities to that impact, drawing that line so that your stakeholders see, oh, I didn't just train these people and have showed numbers of trained people. It's in this specific area, and I've seen over the next few years reductions in that particular area of non-compliances, things along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. I think, you know, in terms of kind of the question behind the question is not just how I measure it, but how I evidence it as a business. You know, we know that's important to show it as well as do it as well. So really, really insightful there. I've got a few more. I've got questions coming thick and fast, so I'll see if I can try and pick a few out. We've got one here around buyer conduct. So what actions can a buyer conduct with or for their suppliers to help them action their changes? Follow-up, could there be resistance, or is this based on the relationship between the two companies?
I can start on this if that's helpful.
Yep.
So this is definitely part of your due diligence processes, that negotiation with suppliers and that building of those relationships. The way that you can implement and mitigate risk is through developing a closer relationship with that supplier, where there is a top-down forcing of just willy-nilly pressure to close non-compliances or to just take actions with no understanding of why they are being asked. That's where we see these things recur, where it is not being led from a team perspective, from a collaborative perspective. So I do suggest working on this collaboratively and in conversation, in dialogue, really building understanding and trust with suppliers. And also, to that point, you often, especially if they are new to this process, you will see better results if they are collaborating with other factories also working on this, or farms, or whatever your industry is. So where you see a group working together, implementing a program, implementing training, updating policies together, processes together, you really see that they are not being, they feel less like it is them at fault or at risk of losing business, and you get a much more holistic and actual real commitment to change, which leads to sustained improvement for businesses.
Brilliant, thanks, Claire. And Abigail, I see you nodding along there. Have you perhaps experienced that in your ETC role with businesses and some of that resistance? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So I'm actually really lucky. One of the clients I've worked with for the longest is Cooperative Retail, which has a really strong emphasis on that collaboration with suppliers, working towards long-term improvements, and really kind of taking that more understanding approach that meaningful, impactful change can sometimes take time, longer than the timeframes that are set by an auditor. So I've had the best training in that possible, but we really find that while buyers have got the most influence and leverage with suppliers, taking that more sort of gentle, understanding approach to things is really important. So yeah, having a long-term relationship with suppliers is important. Having maybe more of like a strategically chosen set of suppliers rather than kind of a vast number, which is kind of harder to track, hard to have those relationships in place. And then just sort of building that relationship through supplier engagement as well. So, you know, holding forums, holding space to talk about these issues that are coming up, talking collaboratively, sharing ideas, looking at industry-wide solutions to problems is really important. And that's how there's been sort of really successful sort of projects long-term in, say, the retail industry, through that kind of working collaboratively with large suppliers and taking their views into account, and acting accordingly. So yeah, really important relationship there. It can't really be understated enough.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you both. I think, you know, keeping that word collaboration, and actually what comes through is that idea of community, and how we're supporting the community, whether that's the supplier community of a buyer or even our membership community as well. So really great to hear that coming through. Time for a couple more questions before I'll close out, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you about the next webinar that's coming up. While we answer a couple more questions, if you want to scan the QR code or look at that on screen now, please feel free. Yeah, I say two more questions. This one's a bit of a broad one. What countries have you seen the biggest improvement in working conditions in the last 5 years?
Oh, that's a fun question. So if we look at the data from the last 5 years, we see, more often than not, we see improvements more at a sectoral level, or we see particular ETI base code areas that have fluctuated or changed. We also have been improving our tools consistently and over the past 5 years. So we are looking to be able to find more issues. That is our job, is to help you to unearth risks that were difficult to find, to be able to find more. So we see increase almost everywhere. We see increase. There are some countries where we've definitely still seen, despite that increase, really great improvements. Like I think Argentina is somewhere that we've seen a real drop in, say, the average number of non-compliances that are found per audit. Italy, somewhere that has definitely seen reduction. and Romania. These are very difficult, challenging countries, challenging supply chains, where we've seen through concerted efforts and through collaborative efforts that on certain areas there have been real improvement, which definitely helps us to kind of track what activities are working and what are not, what's kind of improving and where. So it's very useful to see. But on the whole, because we want to, through these tools, be able to provide the most, access to that data, we do see increase across the board.
Thanks, Claire. And I think it's one of those questions that there unfortunately isn't a straightforward answer. So whoever in the audience who's looking for most improved country or vice versa, unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. And that's why there's so much data, and that's why we give that extra level of lens. Last question. I think this one is for you, Abigail. What's it like in terms of that working for a company, even though you work for SEDEX as an ETC? Do you often find yourself working in isolation or as part of a team in that respect?
Yeah, really interesting question. So it depends, and I mean, whenever I start a new project with a customer, I always tell them that the most successful projects are the ones where the customer is really engaged. So the more teamwork and collaboration with a business, the better. This is just because it's important to kind of get to know different ways of working, understanding different appetites and approaches to risk. And understanding different priorities as a business. So we tend to get quite integrated with the businesses we work with, and that's really brilliant. I've met some fantastic people in the industry and worked with people globally as well. So that's, brilliant opportunity to do. And really understand those sorts of different approaches to risk and compliance. I'd just say it's really important to understand that every business tackles things differently in that sense.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Been excellent panelists today. So you've been listening to the What 5 Years of Audit Data Tells Us About Your Supply Chain. And as you'll see on screen right now, we also have another webinar coming up in April covering how to be compliant with the latest supply chain legislation. So please do tune in if that's of interest to you. As I said before, we will be making the recording and content available and be sent to you by email. And any questions that we didn't get to, because I apologize, we did have quite a lot, we shall endeavour to answer and reply by email as well. So thank you all again for your time. Thank you to our panelists, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.